want to try to do with the rest of my time today is, to the extent possible, abstract away from particular instances of conspiracy theory. So not try to talk about, well, was Grover Cleveland really a tool of the Jews or of the British? But instead abstract away from the particular claims that are made in different instances of conspiracy thinking and try to look at the more general themes, the basic patterns that I think I see in most versions of contemporary conspiracy thinking, and for that matter, the basic presuppositions that underlie most instances of contemporary conspiracy thinking. So for better or worse, the rest of my presentation is going to be fairly abstract, although I'll try to spice it up with a couple of real-world and very recent examples from time to time. Now, before I give you my little catalog, I'm going to try to isolate about 10 different elements, very briefly isolate 10 different elements that I think animate the conspiratorial worldview as such, or what you might call the conspiratorial mindset as such. But I should say at the outset that it is not the case that all of those elements, all of those 10 or so elements, necessarily appear in their entirety or in their fully fledged form in every instance of contemporary conspiracy thinking. In fact, one of the striking things about conspiracism is its amazing elasticity. It's an incredibly elastic mental construct. And what I mean is that it can expand or contract to fit the occasion. For folks who take conspiracy theories seriously and build them into their own political analysis, into their own worldview, there's often a very impressive ability to apply a conspiratorial framework in some instances, but not in other instances. And when it is applied in some instances, it will sort of again, expand to fill the available space. Well, we don't know this, we don't know that, we don't know these particular facts because they've been withheld from us. So let's fill in that apparent gap with a conspiracy theory, but then it won't necessarily go and govern their entire analysis of the world as a whole. And I'll try to say a few things more about that in a moment. So, without further ado, if I can just lay out what I think are these, and again, I might have missed a bunch. For that matter, some of you might think that some of the things that I'm going to isolate as supposedly primary foundational elements of conspiracy thinking that I'm dead wrong about and they don't in fact apply. And in that case, I will encourage folks to bring that up in the discussion. I will also try to say a little bit about how each of these ideas relates to the other. They're all pretty closely interrelated. The first one I would say is a rejection of contingency. A rejection of the notion that some things happen for a series of reasons that aren't particularly clear-cut. In fact, sometimes things happen for reasons that we can't even determine with any precision or with any reliability. The conspiratorial notion is basically that seemingly random sets of events are in fact part of a grand design, that they were arranged to fit together into a certain pattern. Whereas I would say that, in fact, social reality quite often does not work according to anybody's design. It doesn't work according to the design of the powerful or the design of the powerless. It doesn't work according to natural laws. It doesn't work according to the laws of physics. It just works because social reality, as I'll get to in a moment, is a fantastically complex set of interlocking dynamics, and those dynamics don't always fit easily together. So contingency is the kind of thinking that I'm going to put up as a positive alternative to the non-contingent way of looking at the world that I see as part of conspiracist frameworks. The second thing is that I think a lot of conspiracies posit a false dichotomy between, on the one hand, coincidence, and on the other hand, conspiracy. It has to be one or the other to a conspiratorial mindset. Either everything that happens is just utterly random chance. That's the sort of the bad kind of contingency. There's no meaningful connection between anything. Or the other possibility is it's all part of a deliberate and intentional and, again, designed sort of conspiracy. Everything is either sort of utter randomness or it's premeditated and masterminded. And that leads us to what I see as a third misunderstanding of social reality within conspiracist frameworks, and that is a misunderstanding of both what contingency really means in a complex society like ours, and especially what intentionality means, what it means for social actors to have intentions and to act upon them there is often, I think, in our world, often a very common gap, sometimes a large gap, between the goals that people set for themselves and the results that they actually achieve. And what I think is the case is that gap is also present for very powerful people. That gap is present for the President of the United States, or the folks who are in charge of NATO, or whoever runs the Pentagon, or the people on the board of directors of Exxon and of, I don't know, name your other favorite super transnational corporation. Even extremely powerful people experience an important gap between what they want to get done in the world, between their goals and what they are actually able to achieve. And one of my hypotheses here is that conspiracy theory narrows that gap down until it just about completely disappears. In a conspiracy framework, well, if the powerful people want to get something done, they're going to get it done. It's just going to magically happen because they have the power to make it happen. Another way of saying that same criticism of conspiracy thinking is to say that conspiracy theory does not account for fallibility, for the ability of people to really just fuck up. Even extremely powerful people fuck up. They make mistakes. They think that they're going to go into Afghanistan and get A, B, and C done, but in fact they go into Afghanistan and they get X, Y, and Z, which is not what they wanted to happen. That sort of fallibility I see as a constitutive element of the way social reality works today, and it's sort of the opposite of what you would think is really happening on the basis of reading conspiracy theory versions of reality. The fourth point would be I guess you could call a difference between elaborateness on the one hand and complexity on the other hand. A lot of conspiracy theories look like they are very complex. They have lots and lots and lots of details, and they try to make those details fit together in this pretty intricate stream. You almost, sometimes when you read conspiracy theories, it's like you want a flow chart to see, well, what board member of this group was actually at the same time working for that group, which was at that time involved in some investment over here, while the military over here was, you need this, amazing arrows and things to keep things together. Now that looks like a kind of complexity. What I'm going to argue is that, in fact, it's a way of flattening out the real complexity. It sort of replaces elaborateness with actual complexity. And what I mean by that is, to my mind, in a really genuinely complex society, which ours is, both in wonderful and amazing and great ways that we want to preserve, and also in awful and terrible ways that we want to eventually change, there are good and bad kinds of complexity. But for better or worse, the kind of complexity in a society like ours means that the lines of causation are often not at all straightforward. It is often very difficult not just to figure out what caused what, but in fact, what caused what is not a simple question in a society like ours. Often, event X was caused by, 17 other factors, some of them really major, some of them apparently minor. It's very hard to draw any direct connections. You can't have a flowchart that explains our kind of social reality, because a flowchart just has this one dimension. You have one arrow pointing from this discrete object to that discrete object. That's just not the way social action really happens much of the time in our society. Sometimes it does, but a lot of the time it doesn't. So I think that the conspiracy theory, while purporting to be more and more complex, is actually, in a significant sense, less complex than it would need to be. And next, I would say that one of the main sort of logical connectors, argumentative connectors that conspiracy theory relies on is the notion of plausibility. Very often, conspiracy theorists will use plausibility as their, I guess you could say, their chief connecting link between the apparently disparate, the apparently really different and distant phenomena that they try to bring together. Very frequently, if you pay close attention to conspiratorial texts in particular, or even if you just listen to them on the radio, very often you will get this sense of, well, we actually can't demonstrate, we can't actually prove, we can't demonstrate any direct link between these 2 or 3 or 5 seemingly disparate events, but isn't it likely? Isn't it possible? Can't you see how they would fit together if you just accept that, figure X was in the right place at the right time and could have done what our theory suggests that she or he did do? So that notion of plausibility is really, really, really central to bringing the point home within a conspiracist framework. And that is closely related to, this is possibly the single most consistent and prominent element within conspiracist thinking, the notion that conspiracy theories very often rely on insinuation and innuendo instead of relying on evidence and argument. What I mean by that, when I say insinuation and innuendo, and I'm a person who makes copious use of insinuation and innuendo in polemical contexts, and I'm a big fan of using those as a way of sort of getting a point across. What I'm saying is that when we're doing our own analysis, when we're trying to figure out what's actually happening in the world so that we can effectively change what's happening in the world, that's a bad point to use insinuendo and innuendo. And what I mean there is that conspiracy theories will classically suggest a conclusion rather than stating it. That's the classic conspiratorial trope, is to suggest it to the audience, but don't necessarily actually state it outright. If you read a lot of conspiracist texts, like actually written forms of conspiracy theories, you will see a striking frequency of ellipses. Ellipses are when you have a ... like you're about to end a sentence, but instead of actually ending it, you just go ... That's a perfect example of suggesting the conclusion to the sentence without actually saying it. If you actually state the end of the sentence, then you have to sort of back it up and show how step 1 leads to step 2, leads to step 3, and they all support the conclusion that you're actually stating. If you avoid stating the conclusion, you can just rely on all the other elements we looked at and say, well, isn't it plausible that it could have happened that way? And you sort of invite the audience to draw the conclusions themselves without you actually having to put it forward. Next, I would say, and very closely related to that, is conspiracy theories often replace precision. They replace a precise analysis of difficult and intricate details with instead sort of, I guess you could call sort of arbitrary details. And here I do want to give a specific example. Have folks seen Michael Moore's latest movie, Fahrenheit 9/11? I don't know if you remember, but there's a point, I'm going to have a lot more to say about that movie in a moment, but there's one small point in that movie where you have this statistic tossed at you, and it's been months since I saw the movie, so I might have the statistic wrong in my mind, but what sticks in my memory is this notion that 13% of the U.S. economy is owned by the Saudis. I don't know if it's 13% or 9%, I forget what the figure was, but you get this random detail sort of tossed at you as if it told you something really important about the world. And I'm watching the movie and I'm thinking to myself, 13%, I wonder what percentage of the U.S. economy is owned by the Dutch or the Belgians. I have no idea what percentage, but for that matter, I wonder the other way around. What percentage of the economies of the Middle East is owned by U.S.-based corporations? I'm betting it's higher than 13%, but again, I don't really know, and you're not given any of that context within Michael Moore's movie. Instead, you just have this 13% is owned by the Saudis. You have it sort of thrown at you. So I see that as an example of missing the point of a detail like that, because it's not really precise in that context, and it's just sort of free-floating out there, and instead you just sort of given arbitrary or random details. Now that leads us on to continue with the Michael Moore example, that leads us on to one of the really, really less savory elements within classic, standard, contemporary conspiracist discourse, and that is the idea that very often a conspiracy theorist will basically encourage the audience to draw their own inference. Again, don't state the conclusion, but just suggest it. And in order to help the audience to draw what the conspiracy theorist thinks is the proper conclusion, is the correct conclusion, conspiracy theories will very frequently invoke pre-existing preconceptions about particular groups of people that are presumed to be present in the audience's mind, or in the mind of a lot of members of the audience, let's put it that way. And now the classic way that usually happens traditionally, if you give a sort of historical overview of conspiracy theories throughout the century, the classic group onto which those existing presuppositions, you might call them existing prejudices, are then projected in conspiracy thinking is usually the Jews. But in today's world, it's very, very, especially in today's United States, it's very, very common to get a very similar sort of preconceptions projected onto different social groups. In Michael Moore's movie, the group that I see as sort of being the butt of all those preconceptions is Arabs. Muslims doesn't quite do the trick for his movie. In fact, Muslims is such a heterogeneous category that it doesn't quite do the trick for most conspiracy theorists, although some have tried over the last 3 years. But in Michael Moore's movie, it's more just this diffuse notion of Arab people. You see all these pictures of George Bush the elder, George Bush the senior, sitting down to coffee and shaking hands with and smiling with a bunch of Arab men. And all you know about them is that they're Arab men. Why? Because they look like Arabs. They're presented as Arabs. They're wearing those things that they wear. They have facial hair. And what Moore is doing is mobilizing a set of preconceptions on the part of his mostly white North American audience about what Arabs are like, and then using that pre-existing set of conceptions to invite the audience to draw the desired inference, namely, to draw the desired conclusion, namely that, wow, those Arabs and George Bush must be up to no good because, look, they are meeting in these secret places and they're all smiling and they're happy and they must be conspiring about something because that's what those shifty Arabs do or something like that. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I want to speed things up a little bit. One element from that last example in Fahrenheit 9/11 that I think is important to highlight is that conspiracy theory very often invokes a logic of association. Not necessarily even, people are very used to the phrase guilt by association, but there's lots of other sorts of associational logic available to us. And not even necessarily guilt by association. Sometimes it can even be innocence by association, sort of the opposite. But in any case, it depends on this notion of a logic of association. And what I mean by that is that conspiracy theory will take an incredibly complex social constellation. It'll take a very complicated social reality as a whole, and it will focus on one part of that social reality, more or less in isolation from all the other parts, and then conspiracy theory will invest that one part of the complex whole with enormous significance, and will ask us to focus on this one, really, really important part of the entire whole. What I think that is a sort of political counterpart to the psychoanalytic notion of displacement. And I don't know how much folks know Sigmund Freud's work here, but anyone have a good knowledge of the notion of displacement that they want to share with us? A one-sentence? Who has a one-sentence definition of displacement? The idea behind has anyone ever read any Freud? Come on, people. Anyone know his sort of early essay called Screen Memories? So it's a delightful essay. For years before I read that essay, I was convinced that essay was about movies. It was about the cinema. Because in English it's called Screen Memories. And that was totally wrong on my part. For one thing, it was written in 1899 before there really were any movies. For another thing, he wrote it in German. And the word that he uses in German isn't screen. It's, I always say that, covered up memories. It's not about screens. Anyway, it should be about movies, though, because of the content of the essay. What Freud tries to do there is to say that what Freud says screen memories are, if you remember something from your childhood. I have a memory from my childhood of my mother hanging up clothes on the I had this, suburban childhood, hanging up clothes on the clothesline to dry. And I remember there were like pink, bed sheets or something that she was hanging up to dry. And that's all I remember from this particular moment. Why would I have that memory from when I was 4, sitting in the backyard watching my mother hang the laundry? According to Freud's theory, which you don't have to buy, but according to Freud's theory, the basic idea is you retain that memory in your head because it is associated with, speaking of a logic of association, it is associated with some much more important memory that your mind is basically repressed, because that important memory was like too much for you to handle at the tender young age of 4, but because it was important enough, your mind did actually retain this marker of that more important memory, which happened right before it or right after it, or because your mother was involved, or because the bed sheets were pink or something. There's some sort of connecting thing to the repressed memory, and that has a lot to do with Freud's notion of displacement. Displacement is basically when you take the emotional import of one phenomenon in your life and you displace it onto a different phenomenon. You invest that meaning into something else that is happening. And I see this logic of association that conspiracy theory so frequently invokes, I see that as sort of the political counterpart to that psychological mechanism of displacement. Okay, finishing up here. Another guy that I should mention who was actually a friend and colleague of Theodor Adorno's is a fellow named Franz Neumann, Neumann. Neumann was a sort of a political scientist. And Neumann wrote a very important essay about conspiracy theory again in the 1960s called Anxiety and Politics. And in that essay, he identifies something that he calls false concreteness. I really like that phrase. It's a good phrase. It's a perceptive phrase. False concreteness as a characteristic of conspiracy thinking. And what Neumann meant by that is that conspiracy theories very frequently will personify broad historical processes. That because it's really hard to talk in a direct and easily accessible way about things like, a phenomenon like patriarchy, which extends over thousands of years in a wild variety of cultural contexts and shows up in really, really, really different ways depending on the historical and cultural context, it's hard to talk about an underlying historical dynamic like patriarchy. It's much easier if we can personify that in the person of some identifiable, concrete set of bad people who are doing bad things. And the problem becomes even worse, I think. Well, this is jumping ahead a little bit. But it becomes even worse in the case of broader social phenomena like capitalism, for example. In any case, Neumann's notion that false concreteness is involved is, I think, a perfect way of describing what happens in a lot of conspiracy theories. They seem really concrete. They seem like, yeah, you can sink your teeth into that. You can get your hands around what conspiracy theorists say is really happening in the world, but it's a false way of presenting that. It's a deceptive way of presenting what's actually happening in the world, because unfortunately, a lot of what happens in social reality is hard to get our minds around. It's hard to sink our teeth into. It's hard to find really concrete and easily accessible ways of talking about it. Okay, my last point is going to be, to get a little bit more concrete myself, my last point is going to be the notion of the telling detail. Conspiracy theory really depends often quite centrally on the notion of the telling detail. And by telling, I mean the one really revealing detail, or sometimes it's like 3 or 4 really revealing details. The notion there is that this one fact about social reality, once we have discovered it, once we have managed to unmask it, it will illuminate everything else that is supposedly happening behind the scenes. If you just pull on this one thread long enough, if you look at 911, and if you see that something weird happened that day at the Pentagon that just doesn't somehow fit into the rest of the narrative, which is certainly the case, even after that whole ridiculous congressional report about what happened that day, the whole 900-page thing. If you read through, I haven't actually read through all that stuff, but if you read through a lot of that stuff, you still are left with a couple of questions. How could they possibly be that stupid that they allowed that to happen, and how did this weird thing happen at that time, etc.? There's a bunch of unanswered questions that are hard to make fit into a coherent narrative. And according to a conspiratorial mindset, if you can sort of focus on one of those unanswered questions and you grab onto that thread and you just pull it long enough, the idea is that that alone will unravel the whole hidden structure, and eventually we'll be able to reveal, aha, what was really going on 911 was such and such and so and so. Okay, so those were sort of my little mini catalog of what I think the basic characteristics of conspiracy thinking are. And to try to wrap up what I think are the problems with those particular characteristics, I would say that the result of all those 10 or 11 different things is a tendency to hold specific and identifiable, and again, concrete social groups responsible for what seem to be inexplicable aspects of the social world, and usually the really detrimental aspects of the social world. I am often in agreement with a very wide range of conspiracy theorists, including some right-wing conspiracy theorists. I am often in agreement with them about what is screwed up about our social reality. Not all the time, but a lot of the time I agree with them. The difference comes in how do we analyze what accounts for that screwed upness? Is it actually the case that there is some sort of small, separate, identifiable group of people whose bad actions are at the root of the problem, or is in fact the problem a much trickier one of, and this is my own position, a much trickier one of underlying social relationships, underlying social structures that go well beyond the specific intentions or the specific actions of any identifiable group. In other words, it's a difference between if we sort of rounded up Dick Cheney and George Bush and the whole gang and sent them into exile somewhere else, as if any other place on the earth would actually have them, sent them to the moon, sent them into exile on the moon, would that in and of itself have any appreciable effect on what actually happens in our social world? Well, maybe it would have some, but would it actually change the underlying social structures? My argument is no. The tendency of conspiracy theory, even when it doesn't actually say this outright, the whole tendency of conspiracy theory is to answer that question, yes. Basically, if you can find the cabal of evildoers who are screwing up our otherwise basically decent and good social institutions, if you can find that group, isolate it and eliminate it and make them mend their corrupt ways, or kick them out of office so that they're no longer able to pursue their corrupt ends, then that will solve the problem right then and there. I see that as the basic tendency, again, even when it's not articulated, I see that as the basic tendency of pretty much all conspiracy thinking. Now, the analysis that I laid down, the last 100 words, the last 2 minutes of what I just said, that has been said in detail and repeatedly by lots of other left figures in the U.S. over the last 2 decades. Noam Chomsky is an excellent example. I love bringing up Chomsky in this context because when I argue with my parents, for example, who are sort of boring liberals and don't have an anarchist bone in their bodies, when I argue with them and I'll make what appears to them to be an extremely outlandish claim about how I think our society works, they'll dismiss it with a wave of the hand and say, oh, that's just conspiracy theory. And when I try to give them like a little bit of Chomsky can sometimes be a good wedge into that kind of thinking because he's a more accessible writer than some others are. You give them some Chomsky and they'll read him and they'll say, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. When in fact Chomsky has been admirably consistent for decades about, well, no, in his nice calm demeanor, well, no, actually, the analysis I'm presenting is an institutional analysis. It's pretty much the logical opposite of a conspiracy analysis. He is especially consistent, I may point out, when he is out and about giving public talks, which he spends an enormous amount of his time doing, giving public talks around the world, he'll very often draw a bunch of local conspiracists to his talks. I lived for many years in Madison, Wisconsin. Whenever Chomsky came to town, the conspiracists came out of the woodwork and they showed up at his talk basically because they saw him as one of their comrades. They saw him as basically underwriting their own claims about reality, and every once in a while in the question and answer period they'd stand up and they'd give their own little favorite personal preferred version of the conspiracy theory, and Chomsky would very calmly explain why what they were saying was in fact incompatible with what he was saying. I love the fact that he's very, very good about that. So we have Chomsky as a very prominent figure on the more anarchistically oriented end of left-wing politics in this country. But we also have people like Michael Albert, one of the founders of Z Magazine, who's been extremely consistent and extremely detailed and extremely clear about this matter for many, many years, explaining what is wrong with conspiracy theory, why it undercuts an institutional analysis. We have people like Chip Berlet and Matt Lyons. I don't know if folks know them, but if you want a really excellent introduction to the history of right-wing populism in the U.S., the best book in my mind is Chip Berlet. Berlet's name is B-E-R-L-E-T, and Matt Lyons, L-Y-O-N-S. And their book is simply called, what is it, Right-Wing Populism in America? Do you remember, Ian? I think it's Right-Wing Populism in America, a fine book. In that book and in the other public work that they have done online and in published texts, Berlet and Lyons have been for years laying down the analysis that I just said here. Nevertheless, many anarchists in the contemporary U.S. continue to have a more or less hostile reaction to that analysis. The classic example is, did anybody read the spring 2004 issue of the Fifth Estate? I think it was the spring issue. It came out in like April or March, but it might have been the winter issue. I can't remember. Nobody here read it? You got to go pick that up. That was the conspiracy issue. And it had, unfortunately, I just moved across the country a month ago, and I have this issue of the Fifth Estate somewhere at the bottom of some box, but I could not find it before I had to come here. I wanted to pass it around and show it to everybody. The whole issue is about conspiracy theories, and the most interesting and most substantive article in the issue is, I can't remember the title or who the authors were. I apologize. It was months ago that I read it. But the whole thing is a rebuttal of Michael Albert's and Noam Chomsky's and Chip Berlet and Matt Lyons' take on what's wrong with conspiracy theories. It's an attempt to recuperate, to rejuvenate conspiracy theories, and to argue to the anarchist milieu, well, don't listen to those other boring fuddy-duddy leftists over there. Let's grasp the radical potential of conspiracy theories. I think that's pretty much exactly the wrong way to go. And there's three reasons that I want to leave us with for why I think, so we can actually have some discussion, why I think that sort of conspiratorial thinking continues to enjoy a generally positive reception among some sectors of the U.S. the North American anarchist milieu today. And the three reasons I would point to is, one, the anarchist tradition, I think, just doesn't have a particularly strong tradition of sophisticated theoretical analysis. I wish that were different, and a lot of folks at this conference, for example, are in the midst of working to change that. But for better or worse, I just think it's a fact about our tradition that we should all pretty much sit down and face. We have some wonderful political history. We have amazing activists and revolutionaries in our pantheon, so to speak. We have a lot of things to be very, very proud of within our own traditions, within our own histories, but we don't have a particularly well-articulated or let's say a particularly sophisticated or refined examples. We have some of them, but not very many examples of really hard theoretical works about an institutional analysis of society. Instead, that has very often been left to the Marxist tradition. Marxists, many Marxists, not all of them, sort of go overboard on that question and pay attention to nothing but the institutional analysis. And I'm sort of thinking that in this weird sort of negative symbiosis, anarchists have said, well, let's leave that stuff to the Marxists. They'll figure out political economy, and we can go work on overthrowing the state and doing all that stuff. And in a way, that's led to this problem where we don't have a lot of our own models to draw on when we are confronted with problems that basically require a pretty sophisticated theoretical apparatus in order to crack them open. And the next thing I would say is that conspiracy theory often let's make this the last thing I will say. Conspiracy theory often serves a kind of compensatory function, psychologically and in our personal lives, because we do in fact live in the sort of society that systematically disempowers most of us in everyday ways, in particularly striking ways when you're confronted with a guy who's got a badge or a gun or something like that, but in lots of very subtle and mundane ways too, we are systematically deprived of effective power over our own lives. That's the reason we all became anarchists. And at the same time, we are very often deprived of meaningful and, again, perceptive and reliable information that would help us make sense of why are our lives like that? Why do we live in a society structured around disempowerment rather than empowerment? And in response to that situation, which is not a fun life to be living in many ways, in response to that situation, it is very tempting to say, well, actually, while the elite that is in power, according to the conspiracy framework, may have special access to the corridors of power, we, the exposers of the conspiracy, we, the conspiracy theorists ourselves, we have special access to knowledge about what's really going on in the world. And that sense of a special empowerment on the part of the conspiracy theorists that can really help to offset the very real, actual experience of disempowerment that most of us have to sort of butt into day after day after day in our society. So I think I will wrap things up there and encourage a free-flowing conversation.